This is Erin Somerville, and I am going over how a bill becomes a law. While you're listening and following along, you should have this chart that you can write directly on with me, and also your Constitution handy, because I'm going to be referencing a few places in the Constitution. So Congress is the institution in our federal government that makes laws, and Congress is bicameral. We've gone over this feature in Article 1, Section 1. It designates that there will be one House of Representatives, and that one would be based on population, and that there would be a Senate in which each state had 2 seats in the Senate. So the most of what we're doing today is going to be here. You should have already read about committees and some basics about those. But I want to talk first about someone outside of Congress that can play a big role. This might come down to the politics of the day or the personality of the president, but the executive authority, our president, also has some role in the legislative process at the beginning, at the end. So if you go to Article 2, that's the article all about the president, and Article 2, Section 3, you're going to see in the very first few words there of Article 2, Section 3, that he, meaning the president, shall from time to time give to Congress information of the state of the Union. And so in January of every year, the president goes to Congress to fulfill this constitutional responsibility. And that is known as the State of the Union. So how about before we get to Congress making laws, we acknowledge that the president helps set the agenda by delivering the State of the Union address. And that is how he can communicate with Congress an idea of what they ought to be working together to accomplish this year. What kinds of policies will he support and sign into law if Congress can get that delivered to him? Another power he has in the same section has to do with his power in extreme circumstances to call Congress back into session. So if Congress has adjourned for the session and everyone's gone home, but some issue has come up that he needs Congress back meeting on Capitol Hill, he can call Congress back into session. And then in states across the country, they also have this setup between the governor and the state legislatures as well. When the president meets Congress, and that again happens in January, you'll see him in the House delivering a message to members of the House and the Senate, and behind him you'll see his vice president, who's technically president of the Senate, and you'll see the Speaker of the House. But now that is widely publicized. So most Americans think that address is for them. It's technically for Congress, but we can all watch. And for Congress, that puts a lot of pressure on them, because now the president is saying, Congress, get this stuff done and I will support it. And then if Congress fails to do so, all the American people can see that it's Congress's lack of action and that the president wanted to get this done. So by going to Congress and speaking, whether it's at the State of the Union address or later in the year for some other issue, the president uses this pulpit, this platform in the House, to push Congress, to pressure Congress to act. And we call his use of that platform the bully pulpit. And so while the president cannot make Congress do anything, by asking Congress in front of the American public to do something, that puts a pressure on the senators and representatives to act. Some presidents have been very good at using the bully pulpit. Kind of comes down to a personality. LBJ would be one that's credited with being very skilled at using the bully pulpit because of his presence, but also he had already worked in the U.S. House and Senate. So he was a pretty experienced politician that understood parliamentary procedure and how to navigate Congress itself. Okay, so Congress is the one who passes bills, and the president can introduce a bill. The president may introduce a bill. But we're going to talk about other bills. So all of that can be found in Article 1, Section 7. So let's kind of separate here, although it's more fluid than that. And Article 1, Section 7 is all about how a bill becomes a law. And I would recommend you pausing, reading that section, and then we'll reconvene. So pause and read it. Okay, so let's go over Article 1, Section 7. The very first sentence is sometimes a tricky sentence because it's very short, but it's saying a whole lot about where bills can originate. Okay, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House, which means that any other bill, which is the majority of bills, could start in either chamber. And no matter what, all bills have to go through both the Senate and the House in order to be passed. So with our bicameral structure, a bill can start in the Senate. It's still going to have to, if it gets past the Senate, go through the House. Or vice versa, it can start in the House, and then if it gets passed, go through the Senate. And if it gets past both, then it's on its way to becoming a law. However, there's a particular kind of bill, and that has to do with raising revenue. So revenue bills or tax bills must start here. And so we don't feel like we're memorizing that. Why? And that would be sort of lined up with the mantra of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. And wanting to create a government that taxes based on representation means that the most representative chamber should have that power to originate tax legislation. It's still going to have to get approved by the Senate. But the point is, it originates in the most representative chamber, the one that has only 2-year term lengths, representation based on population, and the whole chamber has frequent elections. All right. So how many people are in the House? Today there are 435 from all over the country based on population, and in the Senate there are 100. So given that, which chamber is going to have more rules, more organization? That would be the House. The House has more people, so it's going to need more systems in place to get things done. Whereas with the smaller group, it might operate a little less formally. So even though this is considered the more elite chamber, the upper chamber, it is not as regimented as the House, in which if you're one of 435, you really do have to work your way up and be familiar with the politics of getting legislation out of committee. Okay, so a bill can be introduced by a member, and then it gets assigned to a committee. In both chambers, it's the same thing. And then usually there's a subcommittee that it then gets sent to. So if a bill goes through the House, it gets introduced here, it'll go to subcommittee, committee, the Rules Committee, the full House, and then it can go back and start all the way here. It does not go through the two chambers simultaneously. So I'm having us draw the arrows here so we can see that the path can go this way, or if it started in the Senate, we'll do a dotted line for this. If it starts there, then it goes the other way and back through the House. So just that setup makes the legislative process very lengthy because you're going to have to wait for it to get through one chamber before it goes to the next. So the bicameral structure creates additional checks and balances and slows down the process, the goal being that then the process would be deliberative and would be more steady. Okay, so we're going to follow, for the sake of this, a bill going through the House. It goes to subcommittee. The subcommittee will hold hearings, gather information, and basically the purpose of the subcommittee is to gather a lot of information and not take up the time of all 435 representatives. The folks on the subcommittee and the committee should be experts. They should be practiced in this kind of legislation, and so they would be the ones that are going to decide, is this legislation that should go forward, or should we, in quotes, table it, which is basically killing it. So if the subcommittee gathers the information and they report on it favorably, they'll kick it back to the committee and say, yes, we ought to consider this. Sometimes they make a little, a few revisions that might make it a stronger piece of legislation. Committees operate behind closed doors, and the committees are controlled by the majority party. So if the Republican Party has the majority in the House, every committee will have members from both parties, but the committee chair, meaning a majority of the people on the committee, will be Republicans. So the party in power, the party that holds the majority, doesn't simply have power at that final vote because they have the majority of votes. Their real power is in controlling the committees, which decide on how to report a bill. Are they going to report on it favorably to be voted on, or are they going to table it? When they table a bill, that means that they're setting it aside, pretending like they might one day get back to it, which they won't, and then when the session ends, everything that was on that table gets dumped out. So generally, if you are tabling it, then it is dead in committee. So most bills die in committee. So if you're that representative that introduced the bill and you find out your bill died in committee, you're pretty disappointed, because you know it's probably a lost cause, and you might have to reintroduce it the next session, which is 2 years away. All right, so in the House, if the committees say, yes, this is a great piece of legislation, and they recommend its approval, they are going to send it to the House floor for a full vote. But there's one other stop. And the Rules Committee is a committee unique to the House. It only exists in the House because the House needs a lot of rules around debating and voting. With 435 people, and lots of people wanting to talk, you got to sort of set up the parameters for how to debate. So the Rules Committee might say something like, for this particular bill, every member has 2 minutes to speak and may speak up to 2 different times. And then we are definitely going to vote on Thursday. Or the Rules Committee can say, you know what, all of this can be debated, amendments could be suggested, but Section 2 of this law is untouchable. Nobody may make any changes to it. So the rules they set up are not for the House in every circumstance, they're for the House on the particular bill that's been sent to them. They also get to schedule the debate, so if they just don't find time on the docket for that debate, then it won't make it to the full House. If somehow a bill makes it through all of these stops, gets through the Rules Committee, gets debated, then it will finally be taken for a vote. And in the House, you're going to need just a simple majority to pass. Simple majority, which is 50% plus 1. So today, that's 218 votes. If you get the 218 votes, you are off, and now it gets introduced in the Senate and goes through a similar process of going to the subcommittee in the Senate, who's also going to maybe hold hearings, make revisions. Then, if it gets reported on favorably, it goes to the committee. Again, it could still die in committee here, even if it passed the other chamber, which would also be a disappointment to the individual who recommended it. But if it makes it out of the committee, then it goes to the leadership. So this leadership would be the majority and minority leaders. Particularly the majority leader holds all the power here, and that person then schedules debate on the bill if there's time. They could at this point say there's no time for debate and we're not voting on it. So there are numerous potential places that a bill could die along the way. If it gets set for debate and the Senate decides to vote on it, again, you're going to need a simple majority, and that would be 51. Okay, before we go further into the process, there's a few things to point out. There is a way that the House can meet without having to follow all the rules that exist for when the full House meets. And so sometimes, depending on a bill, in the House they will decide to meet in committee of the whole. And what that means is that they're going to be in committee behind closed doors, but it's a really big committee of 435 people. And that allows them to act in privacy, behind closed doors. That allows them to avoid a lot of parliamentary procedures. And then after the committee of the whole is met, if they can agree to move the legislation, then they will go to the full House, in which everyone is out voting on the floor according to the normal rules. So, committee of the whole. Okay. Let's suppose that you introduced a bill as a senator here or as a representative there, and it gets stuck in committee. We'll go with the House. This can be very frustrating, and generally if it's stuck in committee, it's a done deal. Your bill is dead. But you can potentially get it out of committee. This is not a common occurrence if things are functioning, for lack of a better word, normally in Congress. If your bill has been tabled, but you can get a majority of the people in the House to agree that it should not be tabled and it should be reported out of committee to the full House, what you're asking for is called a discharge petition. A discharge petition. You're asking that your bill be discharged from the table and get back into line so that it can get voted on by the full House. Why this is rare is that to get the discharge petition, you need a majority of the representatives to vote to call it off of the table and back in. But if the majority party controls the committee and the majority party that controls the committee has tabled it, something here does not match up. Because if the majority of people would want it, then why would the committee not have continued the process? Why would they have tabled it? So if you hear of a discharge petition, this means that that there's a lack of functioning among the majority party in the House. But that is something that comes up every so often, and usually this is an indicator that the Speaker of the House, the person who's sort of supposed to be the most powerful in the House, has lost some power or at least some organization. Okay, so we got everything through. Let's add one more vocab word. When a bill is going through, sometimes the committees add a lot of riders. This relates back to our pork barrel legislation. If we know this bill has got to get passed, sometimes members of the House or Senate will add things to it, earmarks or riders, where they're putting in little pieces added to the legislation that might bring home money or jobs for their district. So what might occur is the House passes a bill, and then it goes through the Senate, but the bill that the House passed got altered along the way so that you end up with two different versions. You end up with, say, version A and version B. Now, once the bill is passed, both the House and the Senate, it's supposed to go to the President. But it should only go to the President if it has passed both houses. So which version ought to go? This is a problem. If you send version B, well, that was never passed by the House. If you send version A, that was never passed by the Senate. So what we create is a conference committee, which is not referenced in the Constitution, but it's needed in order to make the process constitutional. The conference committee has a few members from both chambers that get together and they iron out the differences between the two versions, and they come up with a compromise. Generally, their compromise is going to favor the Senate version. Two ways to help you remember that is that the Senate is the more elite chamber, so it might seem more powerful in that way. And then the other thing has to do with a filibuster, which we will be covering separately. But knowing that the Senate has more difficulty passing legislation means that when deciding to make a compromise, they're going to tend to favor the Senate version. Now you have version C, all ready for the president, right? Not quite, because for a bill to go to the president, it has to have passed both chambers, and this version passed neither chamber. Now in this instance, we're going to fast track it. Before, the bill did not go through simultaneously. But now, if the conference committee makes a compromise bill, it's going to go through at the exact same time and go immediately to the full House, full Senate. So it's going to skip all the subcommittees. We're just going to send it to the Senate. They're going to vote on it. They ought to pass it. We're going to send it to the House. They're going to vote on it. They ought to pass it. They don't have to. But again, you're going to still need 218 votes here or 51 there, which is a simple majority. Woo! All right, your bill has passed. Now it goes to the president, and there's a variety of things that could happen here. The president could sign it. If he signs it, then it becomes law. Yay, it's a law. He could veto it, which is usually the end of the story. If he vetoes it, it's not a law. But there is a way in our complicated system of checks and balances for it to still become a law. What Congress has to do is show that they really want it. If he vetoes it, technically he's not supposed to just, stamp it and say veto, but rather he sends it back with a list of objections, telling Congress, here are the things you ought to change in order for me to sign it. So it's, more constructive than just no. If he vetoes it, that means he has made a list of objections, and he's going to send it back to the original chamber that it started in. So if it started in the House, it's going to go back to the House, and it has to do everything all over again. And now this time, in order to override the veto, you're going to need 2/3 vote in both chambers, in each chamber. So it's going to have to go through the process all over again, but this time you're going to need 290 votes and 67 votes in order to get it passed. So vetoing it is pretty effective, and then overriding the veto is really challenging but doable. Our final scenarios have to do with what most of us do when we can't make a decision, which is nothing. What if the president doesn't sign it or veto it? What kind of time limit does he have to make the decision? The Constitution, Article 1, Section 7, delineates that he has 10 days excluding Sundays. Now, in 10 days, if he does nothing, two things could happen. So his time limit is 10 days, excluding Sundays, which I'm not going to write here. Now, if in that 10 days, it kind of depends on what Congress did to determine what happens to this bill. So if Congress did all their work, sent them the bill, patted themselves on the back, and adjourned, meaning that they ended the session, they said, oh, we're all done here, and they left. In that case, during those 10 days that the president is contemplating, he has nobody to send his list of objections to, even though he objects. So if in the time limit of 10 days, he does nothing, so Pres does nothing, while Congress has adjourned. And the reason he did nothing with quotes is because there was no one to hand his list of objections to, then it is not a law, and that's a pocket veto. So the lesson for Congress is, if you really want it to be a law, you better wait to see for 10 days. Now, if Congress is waiting, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They've passed them the bill, tick-tock, tick-tock, they're waiting the 10 days, and the president never sends them anything while the members are waiting there to either override his veto or celebrate the passage of the law. In that case, if he does nothing while they're waiting, it automatically becomes a law without a signature. So again, if the president does nothing while Congress is in session, then it is a law with no signature. So a president might do this because it's an uninteresting piece of legislation and they're busy and out of town. They might also do this because they know that a veto would be overridden, And they might also do this if they want to be on the right side of history, meaning that they know the law is going to pass, they can't stop that, but they don't want to put their name on it. So it can become a law if he signs it, it can become a law if he doesn't sign it. It can be vetoed if he vetoes it, it could be vetoed even if he doesn't exactly veto it. Whew! All right, so complicated process. Lots of hurdles, which we call checks and balances, can lead to gridlock. Things to think about. How do the political parties play a role? What if one party controls this house and the other party controls that chamber? What if both parties control Congress and another party controls the president? All of those party differences can add to the existing hurdles and really create a lot of gridlock. If Congress were to pass something initially with a 2/3 vote, meaning when they're passing it here, they decide that they need 290 and they decide they need 67, what do you think they're doing? If that's the case, they're probably not passing a law. They're trying to propose an amendment. So this process can be very similar for the beginning part of proposing an amendment. But if they are proposing an amendment, then they're not even trying to send it to the president. They're garnering the 2/3 in both chambers so they can send it over to the state legislatures for the 3/4 vote in order to get it added to the Constitution. This is the legislative process, not the amendment process. They can get a little bit confused. The final topic I want to bring out is something that was done in the 90s, and that's called the line item veto, which I will write here. The line item veto. In the 90s, President Clinton was elected and he was elected as a new Democrat, so a more centrist Democrat, and he had to work with a Republican Congress for the majority of his time in office. And one of the big goals in the 90s was fixing the budget, eliminating deficit spending. And so the Republicans wanted to make sure that there was not a lot of wasteful spending. So the Congress passed a law known as the Line Item Veto Act. Line Item Veto Act. And what it allowed was, it allowed for the president, when he got a bill, so the president gets a bill, and here's the bill, goes to the president, and now the president's going to sign it. But what the president could do would just, he'd cross this out, cross that out, and then he'd go, all right, it's a law. So he would find a line item, a particular thing, an item on a line, and he would cross it out, vetoing it, and then he would pass the rest of it. And this came into question. Is this constitutional? If we read Article 1, Section 7, and the Supreme Court took the case. It was New York City v. Clinton. It's not the most important case for you to have remembered, but it was one in which the Supreme Court took a political question, or a constitutional question, about the separation of powers. The argument on one side was that the president, by doing this, was essentially making legislation, and he's not in the legislative branch, so the separation of powers was being violated by a president coming in here and crossing things off. Remind you, Congress gave him that authority, but nevertheless, he used that. The Supreme Court in this decision decided that a Line Item Veto Act is definitely unconstitutional. Okay, because the rules say that only a bill which shall have passed both chambers can be signed into law. And if he's crossing things off, well, then that bill was not passed by both chambers for the president to sign. All right, there was a lot in there. We will continue to be talking about Congress and how it functions, but those are the nuts and bolts of how a bill becomes a law. And you have read Article 1, Section 7, so you can see that committees are nowhere mentioned there, but we do know that tax bills must originate in the House. We do know that there's no mention of a conference committee, but you have to have one version that goes to the president. And we know that the president can sign it or object to it, and that he has a time limit of 10 days. If Congress wants to override, they can with a 2/3 vote. And we know that, originally they needed a simple majority to pass. So simple majority to pass in the first step, but a 2/3 to override. And so what I've highlighted here are the things in the process that you can definitely trace back to the Constitution. The rest, it's not that they're unconstitutional, it's that they are not mentioned in the Constitution. But again, this is a tiny document, and that both chambers are allowed to make their own rules. So if you look at Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 2, I'll write that here, Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 2, you're going to see each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 expel a member. That is not done very often. But they each make their own rules. So how they actually function is sort of dependent on how they've made up their rules, their parliamentary procedures. So you have the confines of what the Constitution says, and then a lot of room for the chambers to figure out how best they can function. All right, I'm Erin Somerville at McCallum High School, and that was How a Bill Becomes a Law.